Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see some of our students, alumni, members of our professional chapter logging on. It's great to have everyone here with us. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Molly Tobin. I'm the interim executive director here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. And for those who might be joining us for the first time, the Alexander Hamilton Society, or AHS as we are known, is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security space, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate on college campuses across the country, of which Zach has frequented quite a few for us. We now have over 2,400 alumni, many of whom are working in the foreign policy and national security space. If you're interested in learning more about what we do and how to get involved, please do visit our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. For the reason we are all here today, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Zack Cooper as part of our America's Role in the World book series. Zack is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies U.S. grand strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and serves as chair of the board of the Open Technology Fund. So Zack has a lot of free time on his hands. Before joining AEI, he was the senior fellow for Asian security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously worked as co-director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and research fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He also served as assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism at the National Security Council and as a special assistant to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Department of Defense. He has published research reports on a number of aspects of U.S. strategy and alliances in Asia and has co-authored several books and written articles for various academic journals and popular press, including International Security, Security Studies, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among other outlets. And I say all that and I'm out of breath, Zach, to give you like street cred for this wonderful book, Tides of Fortune, which is obviously why we're here. So Zach, first, thank you for being with us. Congratulations on the publication of Tides of Fortune. I think it's a really powerful, clear-eyed account of where U.S. strategy stands in the Indo-Pacific, where it could or should go. And with so much conversation, I think today centered around competition with China, your book offers both a strategic warning and I think a policy framework for what comes next or should come next or could come next. And so thank you for that. And before we sort of get into the meat of the book, I want to begin, I guess, more on a personal note, which is what really inspired you to write Tide of Fortune? I mean, was there a moment in your work? Was it during, government or think tank, time where you sort of felt the U.S. was fundamentally, I think, misunderstanding the nature of competition?
Yeah, well, first, it's great to be here and just hugely appreciative to you, Molly, for all the work that you do at AHS and, for the role that I think AHS is playing in our national security community. There are a lot of things that are not going right in the world, in my view, at the moment, but AHS, I think, has been really helpful in building this community that, cares about international engagement. And so I'm really happy to take part in this and everything you do. Um, it's a really interesting question on the beginning of the book. It really started for me almost 20 years ago. Now I'm going to date myself a little bit. I was working in the Pentagon, and I remember every once in a while we would do these very classified war games of how things went in a China contingency. And all I'll say is that people walked out of these war games, and this is maybe 2005. They'd spend, most of the day in a classified room. They'd come out, and you could just see all the blood had drained from their face. They looked panicked. Everything was lost, and this was 20 years ago. And then a funny thing happened. The story, which we'd all told ourselves, which was that the Chinese had figured out how to stop the United States from projecting power, seemed to kind of reverse. And maybe around 2010, the Chinese started doing the exact same things that we had been doing that we told ourselves were no longer viable. So, for example, we had watched as the Chinese built missiles that could take out American aircraft carriers. And we thought, oh boy, our aircraft carrier and forward base heavy strategies are not going to work anymore. And then the Chinese started to build aircraft carriers and forward bases. And this just seemed really strange to me. I remember asking some friends why this might be happening, and there were a bunch of possible explanations, but I didn't think any of them really explained what was going on, not just why it was happening, but why it was happening now. And so that was sort of the genesis of this book, was just confusion about why the Chinese would take a strategy that seemed to be working so well and then actually completely invert things and embrace the strategy that they themselves had shown was maybe bankrupt.
So let me sort of dig into some of the meat here, and I'll just tell everybody who's watching to please hold your questions and or as they occur to you, put them in the chat, and at the end we'll get to them, and I'll ask them on your behalf to Zach. But in the book, Zach, you really sort of open with, I guess, a bold premise, which is that the U.S. is no longer the sole tide shaper in Asia. And so, can you unpack that metaphor a bit? I mean, first, what do you mean by a tide of fortune? But then, how has the U.S. lost the ability, I think, to dictate the strategic currents in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I've gotten much more pessimistic on this front, even since when the book came out. If you go back about 14 years now to when the pivot or rebalance to Asia was first announced, it rested on this premise that the US could build a region that was really robust against some types of malign Chinese influence, whether it was economic influence or diplomatic or military actions, that we could lead the region in sort of making sure that, yes, of course, the Chinese have a role to play, but that they couldn't dictate to other countries what their foreign policy were going to be, and that the US was going to be critical in that, whether that was through trade deals that were going to shape the rules of the road on economic behavior, or the U.S. security presence, or even things like development, which had a security component as well, especially in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. I don't think we can be as optimistic about our degree of influence anymore. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is just that as time has gone on, China has continued to grow stronger and more influential in much of the region. But the second part is that I'm not sure the American people are as willing to accept the costs of that engagement as I thought they might be. Um, and so I think we're at a point now where we're going to have to rethink just what we can do in East Asia. And to be clear, I'm still very pro engagement. I believe that we should be present and active, but I also think that we probably are going to have to adjust our strategy based on the reality that the world has changed. But also, as President Trump has shown, what the American people are willing to tolerate in terms of expenditure of effort has changed. And I have to say, this is sort of a painful recognition on my part as somebody who's spent, most of the last 10 or 15 years writing reports about how US engagement in Asia is possible and it's working. But I think, those of us that are um, watching what's going on in Asia have to be realistic that even in some of the countries that are most aligned with us, there's now this growing fear that the US might not be there, and it's not entirely unfounded. So just to connect that back to the book for a second, part of the argument in the book is, and this some folks on the line may disagree with this, and great, we should have a robust discussion about it. Um, I think the U.S. is still probably the most powerful player in the world, but I also don't think we're as powerful as we used to be. You can just look at GDP numbers, and it suggests that, but there are lots of metrics. And as a result, I think what that means is that at the end of the day, we're going to have to take some different approaches than we've taken in the past. And this is painful for declining powers because we tend not to want to recognize our decline, and we come up with all kinds of good reasons why we're not in decline and everything's fine. But I think if you just look at the power balance between the US and China, it's much closer now than it used to be. And I think if we accepted that reality and then asked the next question, which is, okay, given that reality, what can we do? We'd be better off than just sort of trying to reject it outright.
So on that notion sort of the power balance, I mean, you write that the balance of power has shifted, but the balance of resolve has not. And so what does that mean in practical terms? I mean, do you believe that strategic resolve in Washington is catching up to the challenge?
Yeah, boy, I've probably become even more pessimistic on this in the last couple of months. I think there are a lot of very senior American strategists who are now asking fundamental questions that I didn't think we would be asking about, does the US have the willingness to push back against China, not even just on what used to be thought of as kind of marginal issues, like an island in the South China Sea that the Chinese have built out of nothing, but like even on things that I think of as very central, like Taiwan. And if it were me, I'd probably say, look, we are strong enough that we can deter in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait. I think a lot of Americans, including in the expert community on both sides of the aisle, are asking what are some pretty basic questions about our ability and willingness to uphold what has been US strategy for 80 years. And I'm not opposed to them asking those questions, but I'd like them to end up in what I think is a logical spot, which is, that yes, we can still defend Taiwan and deter Chinese attacks against Taiwan. But, and this is sort of the point of the book, we can't do that the way we've always done it. We actually have to operate a little bit differently because technology is changing and the balance of power is changing as well.
So let me try and pitch a couple questions that perhaps can make you a little more optimistic rather than pessimistic. I'll try and give you the opportunity. We'll see. You devote a lot of time on the role of allies and partners, which I think is a really important conversation for everybody to be having. Japan, Australia, India, Taiwan, which we'll talk more about, the Philippines. In your view, what's the key to building what you describe sort of as this lattice work of allies rather than a single formal alliance, perhaps like NATO? I mean, where are we getting it right? Where are we falling short? Or perhaps in Zach's dream world, what does this look like?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really hard is that many of us, our frame of reference for a competition with another really strong superpower is the Cold War. But it's not all of the Cold War. It's actually the Cold War mostly in Europe. And so what we think of is, oh, we need some NATO-like alliance. Um, One alliance that has shared views on political dynamics. So, in the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact was socialist, NATO countries were capitalist, and they were democratic. Um, so, it's both a political orientation and an economic orientation, but also a similarity in military contingencies that we worry about. So, in the Cold War, NATO focused largely on a Soviet invasion through the Fulda Gap. We don't have a unifying construct like that in Asia. It never existed in the Cold War, but it definitely doesn't exist today. We and Taiwan, to some degree, Japan, care a lot about the Taiwan Strait, but South Korea worries more about, an invasion by North Korea. Japan worries just as much on a Taiwan scenario, but also about a Senkaku Islands scenario in the East China Sea. Philippines is worried more about South China Sea than it is about the Taiwan Strait. Vietnam is worried more about the Paracel Islands than the Spratly Islands. Australia is worried about the Pacific and like broad geography. So part of the hard thing now is I think our intellectual construct says, okay, a NATO-like framework is the right answer, but the world in Asia today, especially, doesn't lend itself to a NATO-like framework. So my friend Eli Ratner wrote a good foreign affairs piece, which you should all read, arguing that we should build towards a sort of alliance architecture in Asia that would include Japan and the Philippines and Australia. I'm more skeptical that we can do that. I think what we're going to be left with is these different bilateral alliances, which may be aligned at times, but not perfectly. I think what we need is then to bolster those with some very focused coalitions, which do very specific things. So I'll give you one example, which is we have something called the Mineral Security Partnership, and the idea was to work with a handful of key countries that have critical minerals to help develop them, and then be able to share use of them so we're not so dependent on China in these areas. Those sorts of very focused coalitions, I think, can be effective today. But it's hard because this is such a different world than we're used to from the Cold War construct. And for most Americans, unfortunately, even people that study Asia, when we think of a competitive world like the Cold War, our instinct is to think of it in the European context, not in the Asian context, which was much more complex and diluted than the sort of unified NATO alliance that has existed basically since 1949.
So let me ask a question sort of about military because it's obviously in the title of your book. And so you argue, I think, that the US has to move away from military primacy as a goal, and toward what you would call collective resilience as a strategy. Now, that's a fundamental shift in mindset. And so, what does that look like in practice? And is Washington actually prepared to embrace that kind of change? And obviously, I think you've spoken a lot about how, since the book's even come out, how you've become more pessimistic. And so perhaps that outlook has changed recently for you too.
Yeah, so I actually think in a weird way the Trump administration is both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time in ways that are maybe a little inconsistent. Um, the whole basis of making America great again presupposes that America is no longer great. So in some ways, it's almost a declinist story, but it's also a story that promises renewal in the future. Um, and in some ways, that kind of lines up well with my view in the book, which is that look, the United States is less powerful than we used to be, and I wish that wasn't the case, but it is. At the end of World War II, we were about half of global production. Now we're under a quarter. If you were to look at the GDP of China 20, 25 years ago and compare it to today, it has grown massively, and our GDP percentage is about stable. So the trend lines are bad, but also that, as my colleague at AEI, Mike Beckley, has written, and frequent AHS contributor, all is not lost. The roots of American power are still relatively strong. So what does that mean on the defense side? I actually think part of the story is we have to do to the Chinese what they've done to us. So they're building aircraft carriers. They're thinking about adding forward bases. We can hold those assets at risk relatively cheaply by building things like missiles, what Bridge Colby would call denial systems. And we need to be doing that very actively. Um, that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is we still have some unique capabilities that even the Chinese can't get close to. The main one would be advanced submarines. So, like the Virginia class submarine is very far beyond what the Chinese are able to do. The B-21 bomber is incredibly advanced and useful in a China contingency. So we both need to invest in these asymmetric capabilities like missiles, but also these high-end stealthy capabilities that are hard for the Chinese to find and target. I think if we can do both of those things, the US can be relatively resistant. But, and this just to finish on where your question ended, it doesn't mean that we're going to have primacy. It may mean that the Chinese can't successfully invade and hold Taiwan, but it doesn't mean that the US is going to be able to sail up to the Chinese coast and feel confident, as we did in, say, 1995, 96, that we had escalation dominance if the Chinese started to escalate. Um, China's conventional buildup, its nuclear buildup, has just been too rapid to give us that level of confidence. So it's going to be a much more symmetrical competition than it used to be. And I think it's hard for many of us in the strategic community to get comfortable with that, but I think we're going to have to.
So let's talk about something that no one is talking about, which is economics, because it's a topic of little conversation. So one of the core themes of Tide of Fortune, I think, is that economic statecraft is no longer optional, but it's actually central. But the US really still lacks a coherent economic strategy in the region.
Yeah.
What would it take to fix that? I mean, is it about trade agreements, investment tools? I wouldn't dare use the word tariff. I mean, what does it look like?
Yeah, well, first, I think part of my realization in the last few months has been that we're probably not going to get there. Uh, what would it take? I mean, I actually think we kind of know what the answers are. We just can't get political support to execute those answers. So, for example, if you were to ask anyone in Asia on the economic side what would have been most helpful, you'd get the same answer back from most people, which is the United States should have joined the CPTPP, set the rules of the road, set the standards so that when China comes in and breaks those standards, there's something to push back against. When we're the ones sort of destroying the rules or not writing them, it's pretty easy for the Chinese to come and do whatever they want because there's no real institutional pushback, not just from the US, but from a broader community. So, part of this is if you want to be active in setting the rules, you actually have to be active in these trade agreements, which I think realistically we're probably not going to be in the foreseeable future. A fallback option is to try and do more targeted rulemaking. Um, Biden and Trump have done this in their own very different ways. The Biden team tried to do this with what they called IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Even my many friends in the Biden team, I think, would admit that that just failed. Um, it's not that the idea was bad, it's just the region wanted CPTPP and they got IPEF and they were disappointed. And even when it came to IPEF, we had a pretty hard time executing, when there was a trade-off for the Biden team between Sherrod Brown's potential seat in Ohio, which he lost anyways, and the trade pillar of their trade agenda on IPEF, they chose Sherrod Brown's seat, which he lost anyways. And so it became pretty clear to observers in the region that if there were going to be trade-offs, the United States on a bipartisan basis wasn't really willing to accept those trade-offs. I think Trump is trying to rewrite the rules in some ways, like on transshipment, for example. He's using threats of tariffs to rewrite economic rules. I think the problem there is now a lot of countries in Asia are just as wary of us as they are of many of our competitors who, in my view, are much more malign in how they've used economic tools. But the US looks kind of malign in how we're using economic tools now. So I think what we're going to get is a lot of hedging by most countries where they want to be less reliant on China, but they also want to be less reliant on the United States. That's not going to happen overnight, but I think directionally that's where we're headed, is a world in which most countries in Asia and maybe around the world want to be less reliant on both the US and China. And so they're going to look for other partners. They'll look for ways to bog us down institutionally and other constraints. And, I don't think that's good for US power over the long term, but I think realistically, it's probably going to be hard for us to stop.
So let's shift to Taiwan for a few minutes. I mean, you are not shy about warning, I think, in the books about the risks of over-reliance on deterrence by denial, especially when it comes to Taiwan. So instead of we can look at this pessimistically or optimistically. So optimistically, what would a more effective posture look like? I mean, how does that balance risk, credibility, and long-term stability? But if you want to be a pessimist, you can go at it that way.
Well, so I'll try and be optimistic here, which is to say, we're imperfect strategists, but the Chinese are also imperfect. And I think the US has an incredible opportunity right now to work with Taiwan to build some of the denial capabilities that you mentioned, to make it much more costly for Beijing to try and exert power, not just over Taiwan, but over the whole First Island chain. That is something we can and should be doing. So, whether it's helping Taiwan build undersea mines, missiles, anti-aircraft systems, just to increase the cost to China of executing an invasion. Those are absolutely things we should be doing. I think that's stuff that the Pentagon under the Trump administration is quite focused on, and rightly so. My argument has been that the challenge is that if we do that and only that, we're going to end up in a really difficult spot in two ways. The first is, let's imagine a world in which the Chinese do an invasion of Taiwan. It fails, but we then still have to terminate the conflict. And denial capabilities don't really help you terminate the conflict. So you might end up in a world where the Taiwan Strait is kind of a no man's land. Neither the US nor China nor Taiwan can really go there and stay there without being struck by missiles or mines. But that doesn't end the war. And simply having anti-ship missiles also probably doesn't end the war. This is an unpleasant thought, but the way World War II ended, in one theater it was with nuclear weapons and the other was forcibly deposing a government. It's hard for me to imagine with the Chinese building up to 1,500 nuclear weapons that we're going to end a conflict with China using nuclear weapons, and also hard for me to imagine American troops walking into Beijing. So I think we need to have a war termination strategy, and denial systems probably don't get you there. In fact, you might need some of those old power projection systems to be able to, for example, choke off the economic lifeline that China relies on. So one part is denial systems may be great for repelling an invasion, but ineffective at ultimately terminating a conflict. The second risk is, let's say the Chinese realize that actually we've done all this stuff in terms of denial strategies that would be effective, that Bridge Colby has written about. And then they say, okay, well, let's just not invade Taiwan. Let's do other things. Let's blockade Taiwan, or let's grab one of Taiwan's outlying islands. Denial capabilities might not actually help you very much in those scenarios either. And so one answer that some in the Trump administration say is, well, let's just write off those scenarios. They're too hard. I think the problem with that is that will undermine political support for Taiwan and in Taiwan. And it might be that the Chinese get what they want politically without ever having to really fight. So I think we need to have capabilities and willingness to use them that demonstrates to Beijing that actually, if they try a blockade, if they try an outlying island seizure, that there are going to be really substantial costs. And it might not even be doable. And that, for me, doesn't look like only denial systems. So the point I make at the end of the book is no military completely shifts what it's buying. And, the book sort of argues that there's an arc as militaries rise and fall, they buy different things. But this isn't going from 0% of one kind of capability to 100%. This is going from 0% to 5% or 5% to 20%. So it's really a question of force mix. It's kind of a nuanced argument that I think is hard to make in the Pentagon right now, but I think ultimately that's got to be the right answer.
So, not only in this book, but I think a lot of your work at large, Zach, really emphasizes agency for regional actors and so much of what you focus on. And so, how should we be thinking about the strategies of countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, who might not want to fully choose sides? I mean, what does a successful US policy look like in a region where hedging is actually the norm?
Yeah, it's really hard. And and I think we've seen, in Southeast Asia, right, where hedging has been much more common. So I've sort of argued that a lot of countries in Southeast Asia weren't hedging, and we miscategorized them. But even I think, will admit now that actually most countries in Southeast Asia are starting to hedge. And in some ways, they're almost hedging away from the US. So a lot of countries are leaning more towards China, probably true in Thailand, a treaty ally of ours, in Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam to some extent. I think quite nervous about what's going on at the moment, and certainly with some of Indonesia's recent action. So, you know, Philippines still leaning towards us, Singapore a little bit on the fence, increasingly so. I think the question for us is like, what value can we provide countries that they really want? And I think if we're realistic, as per the trade discussion that we were just having, it's not going to be market access to the United States, which would be their first demand. It's probably going to be a little bit of a security balancer against China. That was always the case, and we kind of acted like that was the case, but we didn't have to say it out loud. But I think now explicitly, we're going to have to admit that that's what a lot of Asian countries want. And the problem, of course, is that that doesn't mean that they'll want to let us sort of dictate the rules of the road in the region. They want us to be part of the region, but not have the primacy that we were discussing about earlier. Um, my overall takeaway is what you end up with is a region that has really varied approaches from country to country. So in Japan and Australia, I think they're going to be very aligned with the United States for the foreseeable future. Some of that's for historical reasons, some of this is cultural, but there's a clear logic for each of them to staying very closely aligned with the US. I think with South Korea and Taiwan, we're seeing that those relationships could change very quickly. And a lot of this depends on what President Trump does. If he sees South Korea as a distraction from the competition with China, then the US-South Korea relationship could, I think, weaken very quickly. If he sees Taiwan as a problem in the relationship with China, that, US-Taiwan ties could also weaken very quickly. So those two are really up for grabs. And then you've got a lot of the rest of the region, especially in Southeast Asia, where I actually don't think there's that much uncertainty about what they're going to do. They're going to want to have solid relations with China, with the United States, with other players like Japan, the European Union, India, but they won't want to be reliant on any of them. And I think that's kind of the world that's going to exist. But, to come back to something we were talking about a couple minutes ago, this is so different than the world that President Obama envisioned when he announced the pivot, in which like the American order was going to be bolstered and everlasting. This is a world which is multipolar. It's much more contested, where the US has less agency. It makes me very uncomfortable to think about that world, but I also think at this point it's almost inevitable.
So while we're sort of talking, I think about the region at large, how does your concept of resilience apply to the information space and the ideological competition? I mean, what role does narrative play? I mean, play in the Indo-Pacific, and how should the US be thinking about its own messaging to the region? I mean, there's certainly messaging coming out from China, and are we doing enough to confront that?
Yeah, so I don't think our messaging efforts have been very effective. I think some of this is that Chinese messaging is also quite terrible because Beijing doesn't pay as much attention to how democratic societies work as you would expect them to. And so, whereas Russian messaging is actually quite effective often, Chinese messaging is much less so. But I think often what happens on the US side is um, we don't have a coherent logic to what we do year after year. It changes every 4 years. And, I'll give you one example, which is the Biden administration spent 4 years saying America's back. President Trump was bad for the region, but we're here now. Everything is fine. And then the Trump team wins, and Pete Hegseth goes to Singapore, and his Shangri-La speech says, "I know all of you thought that Joe Biden was terrible, and thankfully he's gone now. He didn't care about any of you, but we're here." Well, every 4 years, when the message you get is that half of the American political community doesn't care at all about Southeast Asia, it, everyone hears that message every 4 years and they get it. They get the message, which is that people just don't care that much. So I think, that contrasts with China saying, "Oh, we're here, we're present, we have win-win solutions," all of that stuff. So if you look at polling data, and we talk about this often when I do AHS events, there's a poll that a group in Singapore does called ICEAS. They do every year a survey of experts. The polling's really bad for the United States across all of Southeast Asia. It's bad about expectations of US strength going forward. It's bad about US engagement. It's bad about trust in US. And that's true of the current administration. It was surprisingly true of the last administration. So bottom line for me is, we have to be realistic that yes, when we come to the region, many countries know that the US is still very capable, but they also just don't think the US is willing to expend a lot of resources on the region. So what do we do differently? My view is if we just sort of try and engage everywhere a little bit, it's not going to make a difference. I think what we should be doing is pick a couple of places that we think we can have a significant effect and really devote resources to those countries. Now, unfortunately, if it was me and I was, thinking globally, strategically about this, I'd be thinking, what are those big rising powers that are going to matter a lot in the future? Uh, India, Brazil, to some extent, South Africa, Indonesia. The problem is that, the Trump administration's getting in pretty substantial fights with most of these players. And so I think we've got to invert that and say, okay, what are the countries that are going to matter 10, 20 years down the line that are aligned in their thinking with us in some key components? How can we demonstrate that we're going to be good partners? If we can do that, I think that'll aid American staying power.
Yeah, I would like to say it surprises me that when you go to campuses, Zach, that you're like in the weeds with students on the polling data, but that I think perfectly summarizes AHS students and what we do. So I'm glad to put it out in the public ledger. Um, let's talk about China for a second. I mean, one of the strengths of the book, of which there's many, but it's is a real clear-eyed view that you take on China's own strategic dilemmas. And you don't treat China as an unstoppable power. What do you view the limits of Beijing's influence right now, and how do you think the U.S. can better exploit those constraints? So here, we'll point the negativity towards China now, not us.
Well, here's where I think there's a lot of good news, right? I am, despite all the challenges that we have in our country, I'm still a believer that if you could wake up and decide where you wanted to live, uh, the United States looks pretty darn good, especially if your option is China or the United States. Um, and it's not just me that thinks that. I mean, look at Communist Party members and where they've sent their children to school, right? Um, Look at the money that leadership in China is trying to get out of China because they're worried about the Chinese system. Now, I'm not saying that China's going to collapse overnight. I don't think that's true. But I do think that Beijing had a remarkably stable political order until Xi Jinping took over. And he's made it fragile. And not only has he made it fragile, he's demonstrated that he and a lot of his team don't really have an economic strategy that's going to pull China up into the top tier of developed economies. If anything, it's going backwards, right? So China's consumption problems are not getting better. The real estate bubble has been punctured, which many people thought needed to happen. And Xi Jinping is putting tons of investment into high tech areas. But at the end of the day, the unemployment rate in China is bad. It's bad even for students at very fancy universities that usually would have many, many great job offers. And a lot of Chinese are trying to get out. And I think that's a pretty clear statement about the lack of confidence in the Chinese system. And that's before Xi Jinping dies or steps down. You know, the last time that this happened in this similar vein was really when Mao stepped down. This was not a pretty process, right? You get the Gang of Four, you get very messy transition. Um, and I think we should expect that to happen again. So you've got a Chinese political system that um, is, become even more repressive and controlled. You've got an economic system which, yes, has delivered rapid growth for a long time, but that growth is slowing, and getting up into that top tier of highly developed economies is going to be incredibly hard without more Chinese consumption. And then last I'd end here, at the end of the day, if you're living in China and asking, 50 years from now, is this the Chinese system that people are going to want? I think the answer is no, right? I think people believe that they should have a pretty direct say in what happens in their political systems. And representative democracy has many, many problems. But in many ways, actually, I think Xi Jinping has turned back towards a more autocratic dictatorial system, which is not the answer. So I still believe over time that the way we order our society is better and is a long-term strength. And the Communist Party eventually is going to have to deal with that reality, or the Chinese people will force them to deal with that reality. So that's why I still am relatively optimistic. But I think we have to acknowledge that, we could be into for a very difficult period of years or decades. And it reminds me a lot of when George Kennan is writing about the early Cold War period in 1946, 47, he sketches out what could be a decades long competition. And I think we could be in something, very similar over the first half of the 20th century, 21st century.
So let me squeeze a couple more in and then we'll open it up to the audience. So for everyone, if you do have questions, now's a great time to either put them in the Q&A or the chat box, and I'll get those to Zach. But Zach, because you just mentioned Kennan, I mean, if you zoom out from the Indo-Pacific, Do you believe we're in a new Cold War, or do you think framing it like that misunderstands the nature of today's competition?
So, I think if you look up the definition of Cold War in a book, it sounds really similar to what is going on right now between the US and China. But I also think that if we are only taking lessons from the US Soviet Cold War, we're probably going to learn the wrong lessons because the US Soviet Cold War was different in so many ways, right? One of which was that the Soviets were never technologically advanced and really competitive in the way that the Chinese are. And they were not economically integrated with us in the way that the Chinese are integrated, not just with the US, but the rest of the world. So those are really different components. And then a third thing, which others on the line will probably disagree about, is the Soviets were ideological in a very different sense than Beijing is now. Um, Socialism as a movement was much more focused on persuading people around the world that they themselves should adopt a Soviet style one party Leninist system with a Marxist socialist economy. The Chinese, yes, they have these new global civilizational initiative, global security initiative, global development initiative that are suggesting that China is a bit of a model, but it's much less proselytizing than what the Soviets did, which doesn't mean that it's less threatening. But in some ways, I think what we're seeing is that if you ask a lot of elites in foreign countries who they see as more threatening to their government, the answer in the Cold War was, well, clearly the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was trying to overturn these democracies and install communist dictatorships. But now sometimes the elites will say, well, actually, it's the US, because the US is poking holes in parts of our system, and the Chinese are agnostic. They'll work with us no matter what. I That is also a huge difference. So I I think we're probably in something that a dictionary would label a Cold War, but that doesn't mean that the lessons from the US Soviet Cold War are going to be broadly applicable.
So you obviously just talked a lot about the Soviet Union, which naturally the Cold War, but in the book, it's not one of the examples that you use when you talk about rising powers. Why that omission specifically in the book itself?
Yeah, so the Soviets, we thought the Soviets in some ways were rising for portions of the Cold War, but if you go back and you look at the economic data, actually the Soviets, there were times in the 50s and 60s where for bits of time the Soviet economy was doing better than ours, although it's very dependent on data that is questionable in some cases. But for much of the Cold War, the Soviets were just in a long decline. And it wasn't until the late 80s that we understood just how bad this decline was. Frankly, the Soviets didn't understand how bad it was because they were making up their own economic numbers, as the Chinese do, and as we may start doing. So part of this was just analytically, I don't think the Soviets were declining. Um, I don't think the Soviets were rising, and certainly not rising at the sort of the pace that China has been rising at relative to the United States. So I think if we are looking for a historical example, and Arnie Westad's written smartly about this, the better example is actually the period before World War One, when you look at the Brits and the Germans and really rapidly rising Germany, a Great Britain that has been globally dominant but is losing that dominance relatively fast. I think that period is much more instructive in terms of a rise and decline than the Soviet period, which, admittedly in the 60s looked for a while like the Soviets were really taking the lead. But now that we look back at that data, it's a much more contested environment.
So let me get two more maybe quick-ish ones off to you, and then there's a bunch of questions waiting for you, Zach. We've spent a lot of time talking, I think you just mentioned democracy, and we spent a lot of time talking about the various administrations on Obama, Trump 1, Biden, now Trump 2. But we haven't actually spoken about Congress. And so, what do you see really as the role for Congress in shaping a coherent Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, if every 4 years our strategy shifts because of a change in administration or executive branch, in theory, our strategy on the Hill might not change in the same way, although we sometimes have elections even more frequently there. But I mean, should we be focusing exclusively on the executive branch? Are there levers that the Capitol Hill really should be using more effectively?
So I think the answer is yes. I think we'd be in a much better position if our leaders in Congress were much more active. Um, and I've been surprised on this, including even the last couple of weeks. There's some areas that I thought we had some bipartisan agreement on, like the idea that selling lots of advanced semiconductors that are useful for artificial intelligence to China is not a great national security strategy. The idea that if a political leader of Taiwan wants to transit through the United States, that is both acceptable and not breaking with precedent, or that we should continue arms sales to Taiwan and expeditiously get those packages through. I think what we're seeing is um, the Trump administration is breaking some China here, so to say, and there's not much of a response at all from Republicans or Democrats in Congress. I, I think this is a moment where I would love to see some leadership, both in the House and the Senate, that says, look, we believe in some basic tenets of our approach to China, our approach in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And, regardless of who's in power in the executive branch, we're going to stand up for those basic principles. Another one would be TikTok, right? I mean, the Congress passed legislation on TikTok. The executive branch is blatantly violating the law. Why is this allowed to go on? And I understand there's a deep political component to some of this, but I think John Molinar, for example, the chairman of the House Select Committee, um, he's been calling out the administration, where I think the administration has been doing things on TikTok and H20 sales that violate some principles that I thought Republicans believed in, and I'd like to see others join him in that.
So let me now jump over in the interest of time to some audience questions that we have. So first, um, asking for your opinion on how China's geopolitical activity, Silk Road Initiative specifically within sub-Saharan Africa, may be giving them the upper hand or not in the long term. Do you think that's something the US should be mimicking?
Boy, it's funny, the idea that we would ever mimic China was something that I think most of us used to reject. I think now you can see that there's some areas where we just have to follow China's lead, not because we want to, but because we have to. Um, Industrial policy is a good example, right? Like if we don't get our industrial policy together, we will get driven out of a whole bunch of sectors that are important, not just economically, but from a security landscape as well. And so I think we do have to mimic some of those behaviors. I think the difference is we shouldn't be doing that unilaterally. Our advantage over China is the fact that we have the bulk of the world's advanced industrial democracies, um, I think, still on our side. That might not last forever, but if we and Japan, Korea, Australia, the European Union, the United Kingdom are aligned on something, we can really set a very broad set of rules, but also establish a large market that can be larger than China's market by a significant amount. So I think, yes, we're going to have to mimic parts of the things that they're doing in some areas, but in general, we shouldn't mimic it in the sense of doing exactly what they're doing. We need to learn from what they're doing that's working and then adapt those strategies to our own predicament. If we do that, I think we'll be in good shape. But I have to say, I think we've been very slow in responding to Chinese industrial policy, for example. And so we've got to both do a lot more, and we've got to do it quickly with our allies and partners before we get caught way too far behind.
Let me try and sneak another one or two in here before we wrap. What do you make of the DoD's review of the AUKUS agreement, and perhaps give a 30-second overview of just AUKUS for those who aren't as familiar with it?
Yeah, so the AUKUS agreement was basically this US, UK, Australia agreement to do a variety of things, do some advanced technology development, put some American and British submarines on rotational deployments through Perth in Australia, and then build a nuclear powered submarine. AHS has done a great event on this recently. I I think the reality is that AUKUS was a political deal when it started, and the idea was a good one, but the implementation has been spotty. And so we have a pathway on AUKUS which would help Australia get nuclear powered submarines, but would require the United States to sell a handful of submarines to Australia early in the 2030s when we might need them the most. This was always going to be the politically sensitive portion of AUKUS. And the Trump administration has been skeptical of this for years, before many of them came into office. And so they announced a review. That review was supposed to be 30 days. Now it looks like it's sort of 120 days. Um, I don't know what's going to come out of this. I suspect that there will be continuing skepticism about whether the US should transfer submarines to Australia if the US industrial base can't build submarines quickly enough, and at the moment it can't. Um, but it's also possible that this is just a tool to try and leverage against Australia to force increases in Australian defense spending. So, one difference between this administration and past ones is this administration is very willing to have discord with an ally if it results in increased spending, or transfers. And I would see this AUKUS tension through that context. So I think a little bit it has to do with AUKUS, a little of it probably has to do with gaining leverage over Australia, which does need to spend more on defense if it's going to do all the things that it's promised to do in terms of defense capability buildup.
So let me try and sneak this one in. How do modern factors and advancements like cyber warfare, space competition, AI change the traditional historical patterns that you've identified in Tides of Fortune?
Hmm. Well, it's a great question. Um, I don't think we know yet how AI is going to change these dynamics. So much of the story of militaries taking new technologies isn't actually about the technology themselves. It's about the culture and organizational adaptation of those technologies. And there's part of me that says, well, the US has become so good at projecting power that any new technology probably aids our competitors more than it aids us because we know how to do this really well today. But there's also part of me that says, look where so much of the energy is on AI. American private sector companies are doing a lot of really exciting stuff. And some of this is that culturally we are good innovators. And the US military has mission command where we send often pretty young Americans out with huge amounts of responsibility and just trust their training and good judgment. That is not how the People's Liberation Army works. They don't trust their people. They are removing more and more of them at senior levels and junior levels, for corruption probes. The reality is that I think we're more likely to empower our people to use artificial intelligence on the battlefield effectively. And maybe we'll probably be ahead in the business applications of AI as well, since the companies that we have huge incentives to get that right and are putting huge investments into doing it well. So it makes me a little bit optimistic, but at the end of the day, this isn't really about who innovates the fastest, unless you believe that artificial general intelligence is just going to mean that one player is going to dominate that whole environment. What it's really about is adapting organizations and bureaucracies to use those technologies the most effectively. So that I think is where we've got to focus our time and energy.
So let me pitch you one last question that will give you the opportunity to end on an optimistic note. And so if you lay out several recommendations, I think, in towards the end of the book, and like all, I think, really great strategy books do, and this is forward looking. If you had 5 minutes with the next national security advisor, which isn't necessarily hypothetical, this could be it, Zach. What would you tell them is the single most important thing, step that they should take in year one?
Boy, that is a fantastic question. I think the most important thing for us right now comes back to our discussion about George Kennan. We need an objective. And I think part of the reason we're so lost on China policy right now is I don't think we've had an objective on China in my lifetime. I don't think the Biden team had a clear objective. I certainly don't think the Trump team at the moment has a clear objective. And everything has to flow from that. So I think the national security team, whether it's this president or the next one, needs to come in and say, look, this is what we're trying to do with China. And it can't be competition because that's just something that you're in. It needs to be, 10, 20 years from now, here's where we want to be specifically. And then you can say, okay, should we be selling advanced artificial intelligence chips to China? What should we be doing on Taiwan? How should we handle allies and partners? But that's all got to flow from a clear strategic objective. And if we don't have that, I think we're going to find ourselves just as lost as we are today.
Well, thank you, Zach. We'll leave it on that one. For all of you who haven't yet picked up Tides of Fortune, highly recommend. Zach, I hope you're already ready the next one so we can host you again soon. But thanks for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. It was always a great chatting as always.
Thank you, Molly. Really appreciate it.
Take care. Bye, everybody.